Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories and the people who tell them and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Kendall Haven. Kendall is a senior research scientist turned award winning author, speaker, master storyteller, and nationally recognized subject expert on the structure and use of story. He has authored 34 books and has performed for over 6 million people worldwide. He was the only storyteller to participate in the DARPA Narrative Networks project to research the neuro and cognitive science of how stories exert influence. And now he assists agencies, organizations, companies, and schools to master the use and power of story. Kendall is a man of contradictions. On the one hand, he's a trained scientist. All his work is backed up by hard evidence, and he has the ear of important people like the US Defense Agency. On the other hand, half of the stories he tells are completely made up. Some of the most important ones are about why he hates Burger King and how the true reason he got into storytelling in the first place was to impress a girl. Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Kendall Haven. Kendall, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. And actually, when I'm on stage performing, uh, almost all of the stories that I tell are pure fiction. There are different kinds of truth that you can get at in a fictional story, uh, and different ways that you can focus an audience's attention on concept and on truth in a fictional story than you can in a non-fictional story. Most companies that I now consult with and most agencies, in fact, overlook the power of fictional stories. If I start a story about, and I apologize, I just hit the microphone for jumping into this, but since you brought it up, if I start a story and say, Harvey Jones was the plant manager at our production facility in blah, blah, blah. Everyone's thinking, okay, he's a real person. And I want to know, when did he join the company and how long has he been there and where does he live? But if I said, once there was a man,
Hmm.
you assume that it's going to be fiction. And what you will focus on is not instead of focusing on the life of the characters, you'll focus on how to use the characters to focus on concept.
Hmm.
And
I
important concepts are often easier to get across in a fictional story than in a non-fictional story.
Right, so this is really interesting, and I think what you just described is, if I understand this correctly, the reason why fables and fairy tales were written the way they were written, and the whole, once upon a time in a land far away.
Right.
My understanding is that the the writers didn't want to get themselves in trouble by talking about real kingdoms and real lands when the rulers of those kingdoms could have them literally killed, and that was one of the reasons why all fairy tales are sort of vague. Now, I don't know if I've completely invented this explanation. I don't think I have. I think I've read this
Um,
somewhere.
it varies some by country. Certainly, the English, the little children's, um, those little limericks and children's stories that are English and oriented were virtually all political commentary. It is less true in some other parts of the world, uh, Southeast Asia, and some of the African ones. And many of the Native American folk tales, fairy tales, uh, and myths arose to present as a way to present concept and make the concept understandable and memorable to populations that weren't literate because they didn't have written language, and also then to make them uh, serve as life guides for those populations. But yeah, in a lot of especially Western Europe countries, what you're saying is exactly true.
Hmm. Yeah, I think this is fascinating because everything I've read and learned about storytelling the last few years has been about real storytelling, stories that actually happened. I don't know that there's many people that are sort of in this world right now, business storytelling in particular, that
Mhm.
have any appreciation or that recommend people using fiction. It tends to be the opposite. It tends to be that they a lot of them really dislike fairy tales or anything that sounds like a fairy tale, because they think either that is not appropriate for the business context or that you automatically lose authority. But I
Yeah.
think more importantly that is this idea that it doesn't have the same weight of truth. It's not you're showing something that actually happened to a real person, and even if someone buys the concept as they would in a movie, that would have less power than a real story. Do you think that that is just a misconception?
I think it's an oversimplification. I think there is a very strong and powerful role for both fictional stories, and I'd say business fictional stories typically uh, are A, humorous, B, audience relevant. That is, say, relevant for the audience. Most people, when they think of fictional stories, they think of children's stories and say, oh, well, that wouldn't be appropriate in a business setting. You're right, they're not. Those aren't the stories to bring in. Uh, but fictional stories designed to present a concept are more effective at presenting the concept and then back them up with real life examples that are true stories. And that combination is far more powerful and far more effective than either alone.
Okay, I mean, it's the first. So this is episode 70 of this podcast, and I think you were I mean, I've interviewed writers, so that's a slightly different thing, fiction writers. But as far as people that talk about storytelling in corporate contexts, I think you were the first person to actually advocate for that, which is interesting because obviously you have a lot of experience and evidence to back you up on pretty much everything you say. So it's curious why that has fallen out of the current the mainstream ideas about storytelling, business storytelling. um,
As an
so
example, let me give you a quick example. This came up yesterday uh, with um, the context was around what kind of a project were we proposing, my partner and I, with to a company, and he was talking about anyway. I, I said, there's a story about an architect, famous architect, and a friend called the architect and said, I just bought this new house. I want you to come over and help me. Architect is envisioning, I get to remake the house. He just bought this house, and and so it's a blank canvas. And before he really moves in and settles into it, I'll I'll get to do some wondrous redesign. And as he arrived at the house, he looked at the front and thought of how he'd redo the entry and the landscaping around it, and to emphasize the aspects of the house. And friend met him at the door and ushered him in and said, let's go into the kitchen. And the architect thought, oh, he wants me to start by I'll redo the kitchen. He got in and he saw all sorts of incredible possibilities for building up the flow and the effectiveness of the kitchen. And the friend who owned the house said, no, please, let's into the bathroom. And the guy said, well, all right, well, we'll start with redesigning a whole master suite. And the bathroom, the master suite, the design, the flow of it, the grandeur of it. And the man who owned the house said, in the corner, see that tile? It's loose, and I can't. Every time I try to get it up, I'm afraid I'm chipping the tiles next to it. Can you tell me how to get that tile up so I can re-cement it without chipping the tiles around it? Because I don't want to have to redo anything on the floor. The architect said, that's it. That's why you call me over. And he said, yeah, that's what I need. So architect said, well, I do know how to do that. And he chipped up the tile. Guy said, thank you. That was great. Now that that's over, let's talk about redoing the living room. And the idea was that you take away from that example is, you want to start with what's the loose tile that's bothering somebody. Fix the loose tile first. And then, so so you get then a takeaway analogy. that you can use that becomes very effective shorthand. Working with a new company, working with a new client, you're saying, all right, what's the loose tile here that we got to fix first before we go on with any of our grand schemes? That's fictional story. That's fictional
Sure.
storytelling.
Sure.
We
Well,
use it
now that
all
you
the time.
now that you mentioned architects, my wife is an architect, my father is an architect, a lot of my friends are architects, so I get a great kick out of finding architect stories that make architects look bad. And there's this one which I believe is about Le Corbusier, who was a super influential architect in Europe in the 60s and 70s, I believe. And I know my father really loves him. And a lot of the houses he designed became icons, and became, people went to the houses to see the houses, but people were living in them, but they weren't always structurally sound. So there's this story about this woman, and the house had a leak, and the leak ironically fell right over the visitors book that they had right at the entry of the house. And then she called Le Corbusier and said, this is what's happening in the visitors book, and it's all getting wet. And this is not gonna work. And he said, well, I suggest you move the visitors book then. uh, and that was it. That was his contribution to fixing the problem of the house.
Yeah.
um, all right. So before we get into the meat of a lot of the stuff I want to talk to you, one thing that I think would be super useful to do is to just describe the the essence of the experiments that you got involved with that backs up the most of the science that you've experienced
Mm.
firsthand. Now, I'm familiar with the Pozak experiments. I believe that he was involved
Yeah.
with narrative networks as well. But
Yeah.
yours was the storyteller. You were the storyteller testing a lot of the stuff, right?
No, let me meld that DARPA work in with some work that I've done since then. Uh, and what DARPA posed, of course, starting back in the early 80s, when I first jumped ship out of science research and became a storyteller, the question was, why do people listen to stories? Why do we bother to pay with our attention to listen to stories? And why do we remember information better if it's fed to us in story form rather than in some other narrative kind of structure? And by the way, the research does support that. Yeah, we do. And so we're doing a lot of experiments and really small little testing on why it is that, what is it about story that really hooks people, that makes us want to pay attention. Along came this DARPA project, and it was, how do stories exert influence? And they wanted to know, what is it about story? What is it about the elements of story? So for that, mostly I was using EEG labs. So take an audience, big headset on them, 24 channels EEG tech, little probes attached to their scalp all over the place. And then I would get to design the story material that they would be exposed to, so I could isolate elements of story, take a story, and I'd have maybe 80 versions of it where I'm taking certain aspects of character description or character motive, or the specific goal of a character, um, different aspects of the story, the way that the struggles and the conflicts played out through the story, and give audience number one a version of it, and then bring in audience number two, which were statistically similar to audience number one, and feed them a slightly different version of it. And we have the tracks of exactly the way that their brains responded to the story. So we're looking at naturally what creates excitement, what creates suspense, what creates engagement, attention, empathy, identity of the character. So we're looking at then over time in different audiences, isolating exactly which of those story elements control how we respond to story. That has since expanded into, or morphed into, looking at two questions. How does the human brain initially make sense out of incoming material? You always do. And what controls it? Because what what we find is that what first reaches the conscious mind and you think is exactly what you heard or what you read is not what you heard or read. It is literally a self-created story-based version of that source material,
Well,
altered
Kendall,
from the
if
original.
I know you've been married for a long time. Anyone that has been married for a long time knows that what one person says and what the other person hears are not necessarily the same thing.
Ex- and yet the person who is hearing it thinks what reaches their conscious mind is exactly what the other person said, and it's not. And it has to do with this process, calling it the make sense mandate. There's a mandate within your brain to force information as it comes in to make sense to you. If it can't make sense to you, you give yourself permission to totally ignore it. Um, and in making sense, what we were able to show is that you're forcing that material into story form. And so it can be a chicken or the egg thing as to whether brains have always been hardwired and constructed as story creating entities, or whether over time, because we use stories starting at about 150,000 years ago as a primary vehicle for communicating values, experiences, concepts, whether we evolved into it. Either way, that's the way our brains are now. So we make sense of it by creating a self-created story-based version of that source material, which makes sense to us. And that's the version that gets to our conscious mind, and that's the version from which we create meaning.
Hmm.
And the
That's
idea is trying to control the meaning.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So that I want to make sure we that point comes across as clearly as it can, because that was one of the first things as I started reading your book that has stayed with me. That particular part, perhaps more than any of the other stuff, and I'm referring to Story Smart here, one of your two books
Mhm.
on the science of storytelling, and this is the idea that the what you call the neural story net that turns every bit of information we receive into a story before it gets to our conscious mind. So it doesn't matter if there is a story there. And I gave a talk just a few days ago and I had just read that. And then the example I gave to them is I say, if I say to you, I have not called my mother in 10 years, your brain is now creating a story of why that is.
Very
Your
good. Yeah.
brain is trying to figure out, why does he not like his mother? Does his mother not like him? Does he still even have a mother? And yes, I know the answer is none of those things. Actually, it's that my I outsourced calling my parents or calling family to my wife. She's a lot better at that. She remembers, and that's the reason I haven't called my mother in 10 years. I still speak to my mother before someone thinks I'm the worst son in the world. And that's what, as an example, is your brain will pick a story, and worse is once it's picked the story, I will struggle to tell you sort of the true story or the right story if I give you facts that don't match the story in your brain. There will be a resistance there, even though I'm trying to tell you that what I'm telling you is true and what you believed is not.
Absolutely. What we find is that as you create this story, for example, take that one. Yeah, I haven't called my mother in 10 years. And people are thinking, well, why hasn't he called his mother? What's his relationship with his mother? What you're looking for are what are the motives, and what's he trying to do by ignoring his mother? You're looking for you're trying to infer specific story elements or everybody's mind, goal, motive. Um, have they had a fight? Is there conflict? Is there a problem? Those core elements are the ones that define effective story structure. Once you create that story, what we find is that the human brain tends to interpret incoming information to support our existing attitudes, beliefs, and values. That is to say, our existing sets of stories. And we resist mightily anyone trying to alter those stories. you can see little parts of the brain. There's a little area over here on the right-hand side near the front that lights up, that is in effect is the resistance part of the brain that tends to separate the cognitive brain from the core parts of belief, attitude, values, so that it was really discovered during a lot of the anti-smoking research. People would be fed information on smoking, about how bad it is and how dangerous it is and all the terrible things it does, and people would cognitively get that and cognitively agree with it, and and would say, "Yeah, let's talk about it. Do you have a cigarette?" Uh, because you can see this part of this little resistance part laid up that protects the core values, beliefs, and attitudes that I'm addicted to smoking. I love smoking. I have to smoke. And so cognitively they could say, yeah, I hear your story that smoking is bad, but mine is that I'm a smoker. And your information doesn't affect my story. Um, Stories are this very deep-seated things in human brains. Our brain, we are really homo narratus. We're story animals. And the thing about what I think is most amazing is what we're able to show is that neural story net, that process of turning information into story form, lies between your conscious mind and the outside world. And nothing is going to get into your conscious mind without going through that neural story net. It's part of that initial subconscious automatic processing. That is to say, it's all going to get converted into story form. So why tell stories and why think about information in story terms? Because your audience, whether they want to or not, is going to do it anyway.
Yeah,
If you
that,
think
that's
about the
that's the
story first.
that's sort of what's stuck with me is this shift in perception between stories as something you tell or stories as something you do, to every everything your brain processes, at least every bit of information your brain processes, will end up in the form of a story, whether you like it or not. And how a lot of people don't see it that way, or don't are not aware of it. And it just reminded me of David Foster Wallace's inauguration speech or commencement speech. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's called "This Is Water." So he
No.
opens. So it's a graduation speech, and
Mhm.
it's a graduation speech, and he just opens with this little anecdote, and he says, there's these two young fish swimming along, and they meet another fish and swimming the other way, and the other fish nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two young fish keep swimming, and then eventually one of them looks at the other and says, "What the hell is water?" And and he makes fun of himself, like, every graduation speech needs to start with a parable. But he talks about how real, being aware of the things that matter, and how a lot of people are just not aware. And then he keeps repeating "This is water" throughout the speech.
Very
and
good.
and and is the, this idea that
Yeah,
it
and
will
that, by
become a
the way,
story no matter what. That's a
that, by the way,
fictional
is an
story.
excellent example of a fictional story used to
Yes.
present a concept that then
Yes.
plays into real life examples later. Um,
Yes.
but yeah,
Yes.
it's amazing that to think that the reason to use stories consciously, the reason to think about how to present your material in story terms, isn't about that you want to tell a story, or even if you think you like telling stories, or even if you think you're going to tell a story. It's that your audience is going to automatically hear it and cognitively interpret and understand it in story terms. So
Yeah.
if you think in story terms, you get you have a much better chance of controlling how your audience makes sense of your material and then creates meaning from it, which is what you really want to control.
Yeah, this is I love that concept where which is essentially they they will hear a story. At the end result is that in their brain there will be a story. The
Right,
question is it going to be your story or their
right.
story? And I, your research and book goes on to talk about how if you want it to be your story, there are certain steps along the way and certain elements that need to be respected, so it arrives at the destination unchanged. And just before we jump into the actual elements, one thing I don't not sure if I got from the book, which was that when you started that those experiments,
Mhm.
did you have did you have a completely different list of elements that ended up being altered along the way? Were they more or less the same elements you had intuited through experimentation of telling stories? That I'm not sure
Actually,
I got from the book.
that's something my wife brought up at one point. Uh, by the time I got to that project, so we're talking 2011, 2012, I had been teaching workshops for, gosh, 15 years on the structure and elements of story. And as I started those experiments, my wife said, "Okay, what are you going to do if you find that everything you've been saying for the last 15 years is wrong? What you go back and apologize to all those thousands of people?" And
You
um,
wouldn't be the first, Kendall, I don't think.
so luckily, what I found was that uh, no, the elements didn't change. Uh, they became far more specific and have since then become far more specific, and we understand what those elements, each of those elements, contribute in a much more profound and articulate way than I did before. And so that the weight of some of those elements have increased and the weights of some of them have decreased. That is, say, the contribution they make to controlling the story image and the meaning that get created in an audience's mind. They have changed, but not the elements themselves. Motive, for example, motive, it, that is to say, motive is the information that explains why a character wants a certain goal, why they're after something, why they want to do something. This is where we get to the values, beliefs, attitudes, the problems, the concerns. Those deep-seated issues: family loyalty, um, patriotism, pride. So some motives are very noble, and some are very self-serving, and you try to keep them hidden. But we find that those are how most audience members decide their attitude toward and then their relationship toward every character in the story. It's called
Hmm.
motive matching. And
Let me just take a
no,
step back and just
yeah,
list the elements just to make sure because I do want to talk specifically about some characteristics of some of the elements,
mm,
but just so we have it on on the recording, the elements. Let me see if I get them right. So there is a character. That character has traits. The
right.
character is one has a goal. They're trying to achieve
So
something, and there's a reason why they want to achieve that, and that's their
that's
motive.
motive.
Stopping from getting to achieving that goal, there are problems and conflicts that will
Mm,
create risk and danger, and then the character has to struggle past those problems and conflicts, and that story needs to be told with sufficient relevant detail so it
detail.
seems real and vivid to us.
Yep,
Those are the eight, right?
those are the eight. Now, if you go through them first, all effective stories are about characters. We A person jumped off a cliff. Well, we don't care about the act. Uh, Um, it's funny in most Western cultures, action events are grossly overrated. Um, Events themselves are always boring. Children prove it every day by writing plot-based stories, and the stories are all pretty boring and dull. Effective stories are all character-based. We want to know not what happens to a character, but how the character reacts when something happens and why they react the way they do. Character-based, and it's not just the main character. There are certain key character positions. It turns out that our brains are hardwired to seek out and to assign to the various story characters. Main character, we always look for who's opposed to the main character, the antagonist position, and those are pretty well known. Um, the other key questions are character positions. Who is the audience, your target audience, going to identify with? Who are they going to care about most when they look at this story? Who is it that they side with, that they empathize with the most? That identity character, and then who has the power? Who is it that really has the power to make the story come out the way they want it to? That often it's called the hero position, but the hero position assumes that it's going to come, that the story is going to end the way that the main character and the audience want it to. Many real life stories don't. And in fact, if you look at folk tales, a lot of folk tales can be divided often into stories that end well, and they set up sort of their example stories, role model stories, how the life should be, and stories that end terribly, cautionary tales where things all go wrong. And that in those tales, that climax character, that power position character, acts so that the main character winds up not getting what they want and is destroyed. But you can go either way. So those character positions. Then we get to
Let,
the
let me
character.
let me let me pick up on one, because this one is very important, perhaps the most important of all. But I don't think this is something people naturally realize: the identity character.
Mm,
So when you started talking about the identity characters and who the audience relates to, my first instinct was, well, perhaps because most of my stories are, 3 minutes long, and the character in the story is usually me. It's like, well, the person, I have to be relatable. I have to be the identity character, because otherwise the story doesn't work. If they don't identify with me in that example, the story simply won't work. Then I started thinking of longer form storytelling, for example, movies. And it's pretty common in movies where there is a sidekick or a friend, and that friend is the one that you actually care more about. Is the one that is a bit more like you than perhaps the hero of the story. Um, and I realized, yeah, sure, if you identify with the strange goth friend, and that one has a really bad ending in the movie, that's
yeah.
it's gonna put you off whatever happens to the main character.
Yep.
But my question to you is, in stories that are not long form, that don't have lots of different characters, is the main character not being the identity character just bad storytelling?
No.
Or
Let me give you an example. A couple of corporate examples. So many times, corporation is going to change some policy. So, some new program comes in. Maybe it's a benefit program. Maybe it's a procedure program. And so they want to tell the story to all of the frontline workers in the company. Here's the change. And so often they'll say, you know, we, the company, or me, the CEO, I am telling the story. This is what I want to do, and this is, and so that where we have this new procedure, and it's going to be better for everyone, and frontline workers, often will flip the story and walk away thinking, oh yeah, it's good for him, it's terrible for me. We get shafted again, and hear exactly the opposite of what the CEO wanted them to hear. What happens is, in that kind of a case, if the company is telling a story where they're putting themselves in the position of the main character of the story, I'm telling a story about me and a new benefit package, or a new process, a new organization, maybe structural organization that we're doing inside the company, and this is why we're doing it, and this is how it benefits us. But if they tell it from their own point of view, often those frontline workers won't identify with that main character.
Hmm.
And so what happens is, typically then they'll identify with someone in that that with themselves, or a character that shows up in the story as that's more like them. And what happens is, then they'll flip the story so that that main character, instead of being the main character in the minds of those frontline workers, will become the antagonist, the problem, the bad guy.
Yeah, what this is
And
what my question
so,
was about. Is to me, I mean, perhaps I'm simplifying things, but to me, that would be bad storytelling. If you
um,
are telling this if it is in theory, you're trying to get the buy-in of your workers,
yep,
then surely the story needs to revolve around either a worker or someone who's relatable to the workers. The
sure.
CEO cannot be the lead in that story because it won't be relatable.
And yet, time after time, the CEO, the department manager, the head of HR, whoever it is, will tell the story from their own point of view. It also happens to elected officials all the time. They'll tell the story from about them and about what they're doing and about their efforts, rather than think about who's my target audience and how am I going to get them to relate positively to this story and to the characters that I put in this story. So what it means is that what the science of story lets us do is give us tools to let us engineer the stories. Every aspect of story, who the story is going to be about, how you present that character, what you tell about the character, how you word their goals and motives. All of those elements are variables that are at your beck and call, at your individual control. A story just isn't a thing that happens. It's like a brick wall. It's not just a solid mass. It's a pile of individual bricks that you get to form any way you want to create the wall that makes sense to you, that tells the story you want to tell. And so, uh, effective storytelling is learning what are those elements, those individual elements, and how do I want to structure them so that the audience I want to tell the story to will receive the audience or receive the story the way I want them to and get out of the story what I want them to get out of it. it, and a lot of it, it's like reverse engineering. You start with what's the effect I want to have on my audience? What I want them to do? And what beliefs or attitudes do I want to change in them in order to get them to behave the way I want them to? And then what story has to enter their conscious mind in order for that change in belief or attitude or values to take place? And then, all right, well, how do I form a story so that it'll get through their neural story net and all that initial processing and get to their conscious mind the way that it has to get to, so that the effect I want will happen. So you start with the effect and back up to the story that you have to provide and tell. Um, and there is no one guaranteed way to always structure a story. It depends on the effect you want to have and how you want your audience to feel at the end of the story. How do you want them to be motivated to act, to think differently than they did before?
One of the things I thought was very, very interesting in the way you describe one particular element, which is motive, which,
Uh,
time and time again, you talked about how this is one of the most influential ones or one of the most important ones for influence, and people overlook it. But you actually describe what's a good motive and what's a bad motive. So what is a bad example of a motive in a story?
um, well, look at it as we use motives. We, the audience, use stated or implied motives, and always picture yourself walking down the hallway and someone else passes you and says, I mean, in you're an office setting, picture yourself, you're in a corporate setting, and someone passes you and says, oh, that 2 o'clock meeting this afternoon, you don't have to attend. And your first thought is, why'd they say that? Why don't they want me to attend? What should I be worried about this? Is this good? Is that good news or is that bad news? What you're looking for is what's their motive. Those are all motive questions. All the why questions are motive questions. We always in every situation are seeking out why did they do what they did? Why did someone else do what they did? But so often we don't state what our motives are. So we're used to trying to imply motives from the actions of a character. So in a story, we use the stated or implied motives to determine how we feel about the various characters in the story. Effective motives are those that lead the audience to look at the story characters you present, be they real characters, be they fictional characters, the way you want them to look at those characters. Ineffective motives or bad motives are those that tend to drive the audience to look at the characters in a way that is contrary to the way you want them to look at the characters. It's amazing how easy I can take a 10-minute story. Did this all the time in the lab, and change one sentence in that story that reverses the motive of a character, and it completely changes the way that the audience expects the story to end and wants the story to end, and the way that they feel at the end of the story, thereby completely changing the meaning they get from the story and the effect the story has on them just by changing motive. It's an amazingly powerful tool. And what you have to know is that whether you say anything about motives or not, every audience member at a subconscious automatic level will be seeking and inferring motives to your characters.
Yeah,
What we
there
find
was.
is that most people do, when they have the chance to infer motives, infer negative motives, self-serving motives, those that even cruel, condescending motives to people, and so they tend to flip and turn against those characters. The only way around that is to be very clear on what the motives are on the characters, real or fictional characters you present, why they're doing what they're doing, why they're saying what they're saying, and make sure that that comes across to your audience. Otherwise, the motives they infer will often be radically different than the motives you intended, or that in fact are the real motives of a character. Go ahead.
Yeah, just yesterday I was talking to someone about that, and the example I used was, take a story about a father trying very hard to make his son a great swimmer. And you can have the exact same story, and if at some point of the story you say something like, um, you know, losing one child to drowning was, that can never happen again. That's one story. But if
Right.
the line is, no son of, I was a champion swimmer, no son of mine can look bad in the water, then all of a sudden it's a completely different story.
Right. And that's just a flip of motive. Yeah.
Yeah, and you talked about as well I was trying to get at the idea of how specific the motive needs to be. I think you said something like happiness is as a goal or as a motive, it's a bad one. Like you don't want that type of loose thing.
Especially, we often think of difference between goal and motive. A goal is what someone needs or wants to do or get in a story. Goals need to be very tangible and specific. Happiness, for example, is a terrible goal, partly because no one knows what that looks like. We can't tell if a character's happy or not happy. So we don't know if they got there or they didn't get there. Peace on earth is a terrible goal. And now we say, wait a minute, it's a good goal. In the story terms, it's terrible because we're not quite sure what it looks like.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
Goals need to be tangible. They need to be something that we can all visualize, so that we can always measure moment to moment in the story. Is the character getting closer to the goal? Are they getting to the goal? That's not true. Motive is where values, beliefs, attitudes come in. But what makes a motive effective is if the audience will be able to instantly, once they perceive that motive, be able to visualize how it drives the character and how it compares to their own motives. And that's where ones like happiness are very vague.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah, we all want to be happy, as opposed to family loyalty. Putting family above family, blood before anything else. The kind of motives that really drive people. I've lost one son to drowning, and I couldn't bear losing another one. As opposed to, I want this kid to look good to make me look good.
Yes.
So that's a different motive. but effective motives are ones that the audience, can visualize and feel the effect of that motive, and then relate it to our own motives that give us that same drive, that same sense of purpose. And that's when we start to identify with the character
Yeah.
or turn against the character. So those motives are always there. Corporate stories are notorious for skipping over motives and just going straight to the solution, the goal and the solution. Here's the problem. Here's what we're going to do, and skipping over the motive part. But yet the motive is what really hooks the audience, and gives the people in the audience, in your target audience, a reason to get behind that program, that change, that whatever it is that you're trying to get across.
One example that just occurred to me about the power of motive to change the perception of a story or a character is Breaking Bad. Which, and if you
Mhm.
haven't watched it, I'm going to spoil it for you and anyone else, but it's been around for a while. Is
Yeah,
that Breaking Bad? In the beginning, it looks very clearly that the main character, who's a chemist and he has cancer, he's going to die, he needs to leave enough money for his family, and he gets into the drug business because
right,
of that. That seems his motive. But the more the story progresses, the clearer it becomes that what he's really looking for is to feel powerful. And then he starts taking actions that clearly say, I'm not doing this for the good of my family. The real reason I'm doing this is because I want to feel that I'm superior to other people, or that I feel that I am as good as I always thought I was, compared to the people
Mhm.
around me. And by the end of it, if you're paying attention, by the end of it, he's clearly the villain of the story.
Right.
Everything that happens, the bad things that happens to most of the people he loves happen because of him, that it don't
Yeah,
happen for anyone else. Yeah.
yeah. It it's a real clever twist on motive, where it, and this is something you can't do in a short story, in a 3-minute story or a 4-minute story, but you can do it in a movie, you can do it in a novel, where you present a character, and then by either revealing motive over time, or shifting motives over time, you completely change the audience's take on that character, and flip him from being a good guy to villain, from being, you know, someone that I identify with to someone that I despise. Yeah, and that's all. What does that is all motive.
Mm.
That
Y-
Go
Sorry, go
ahead.
on.
Oh,
No,
I
I
was
was just gonna say that. Sorry, you go first.
no go. I was going to shift to one of the different elements, but
Well,
go
I
ahead.
actually I was gonna do the same. So I was gonna talk to you about two things that I've read you talking about when it comes to details that I don't think I've come across before. So the first one is this idea of the relevant details, and what they can do to a story. And well, so let's tackle that first. And
Yeah,
as you talked about it, I had this idea, which I have to then explain, so it's not a particularly great analogy, is the Chekhov's gun of irrelevant details. Now, for anyone who doesn't get that reference, Anton Chekhov, who was a writer, he had this idea that if there is a gun in the scene, in a book or in a theater, and in a play, in the first act, by the third act, that gun needs to be fired. Otherwise, you're just confusing the audience. And why is that gun there? The gun serves no purpose, and you're misdirecting the audience. So you talked about how you have to be very careful when you choose your details, because the details might lead the audience in one direction, and you might not want to misdirect them. If you want to misdirect them, that's fine. But if you don't, you're just creating cognitive load and
right.
sending them all sorts of weird directions. That's the gist of it, right?
Yeah, it's part of the way we've been trained to listen to stories. We assume that if there's information in the story, it is relevant. It's sort of an assumption you make. You go through life and you see all the people walk down the street, and they may be, talking on a cell phone, or they may be walking down the street tapping on a laptop or an iPad, and you see it, but you don't require that. Your mind doesn't assume that that's relevant to you, so you just let it go. Let it go. But when you get into a story, you assume that the information in the story is relevant. And when we talk about details are this odd thing. They are both good and bad. What are details? Think of the way you get information about the world. You get information through your five senses. That's the way information comes into you about the world. What are details? Details are the information that your senses would give you if you were really there collecting information on your own. So when we talk about details, what we really mean are bits of sensory related information. What something looks like, sounds like, what it feels like, smells like, that's detail. In order for your mind, if you're in the audience, to be able to visualize and picture this story, and if you can't do that, you won't become involved in the story. It won't have any impact on you. You need the details. You need a sufficient number of details to be able to visualize the story. However, every time you put in a detail, you slow the pace of the story a little bit. They don't come for free. You pay a price for the details. If you leave out the details, you pay a huge price. If you put in too many details, you bog down the story. All the tension and the excitement go out of the story, and you lose the audience. So you're always looking for what is that sweet spot with just enough detail so that they can visualize the story, but not so much detail that I bog it down, which means that each of those details that you do include about what characters look like, sound like, smell like, what the scenes are like, what the settings are like, what's, the little detail, is there a gun or isn't there a gun? Those details are the ones that you include will be the ones that the audience uses to build up a picture of what this whole place looks like, what they would see and hear if they were standing there in the middle of that scene.
Yeah, I tend to think of it as the challenge of the storyteller at times is what is the biggest bang for your buck you can get from one detail. So, for example, I grew up
Really,
in the 80s. So, if I want to tell someone about the time I grew up and what exactly the time was, I could say something like, I'm from the time that when the top of the pops came on the radio, I would stand next to my stereo with one finger in the play, one finger in the record, waiting for the one song I wanted to finish my mixtape. And if I say that, I mean, a lot of people get like, some people have no idea what I'm talking about, and some people will be taken back to their childhood, and now their brain is full of images. And probably that's all I need to say about, that I grew up in the 80s. I don't need to talk about people's hair. I don't need to talk about the type of music that we were listening to, and they will get it. But at the same time, one of the types of stories that annoys me the most is the one where people feel that they have to give 5 different descriptions in the space of a few sentences so you can see and hear everything that's on the scene instead of getting a taste for what's on the scene.
Right. One of the powers of story is that it is really co-creative. The person telling the story provides a couple of those key relevant details. And then what the audience member does is take those and say, and literally create comparable levels of detail to fill in the scene around it. So that, and then two things happen. One is they get this vivid, more detailed scene in picture in their head, which is perfect for them because they, to a large extent, created it, but they give all the credit for it back to the story, back to the original source story. If you, the teller, force them to take all of the detail, put in too much detail, what happens is that there's a cognitive conflict that happens between the scene the way they want to create it and the scene the way you're forcing them to create it. And so that they tend then to back away from the scene and back away from the story and stop their emotional involvement with the story.
Which happened to everybody that's ever watched a movie after reading the book. Because that's not a scene in my head.
Right.
That's not what these characters look like.
It happens all the time. But the next step in that is, because the movie overload you with visual detail, I mean, that's what you get from a movie, right? It's constant visual detail. Afterwards, if you read the book and then watch the movie and then quiz people, their images of the story tend to be based more on the movie than on the book because that's what flooded them with excess detail. You get far
Mm.
more detail. You can't put that much detail in a book. Um, it's amazing how restricted you are, even in a novel, with how much detail you can really include. So you're really counting on the audience to supplant, fill in all the scenes around the details that you do provide. Well, in a movie, you have to provide all of that scenic detail. So
Yeah. I guess the question, the instinctively my feeling, perhaps because I'm a reader, is that I because I have to work to create the scenes in my head, I end up significantly more engaged
sure,
when I'm reading a book after a certain point. And I notice this a lot because I tend to read like fantasy and science fiction, and I always notice that there is a point in the book where I now understand the world enough that I'm not trying so hard to imagine it. And then I just get lost in the story. And then the books 2 or 3 or whatever many books there are go 5 times faster than book one went. Because now I kind of know what I'm looking at, quote,
the danger
inverted
there
commas.
for the writer, however, is that all during book one, you, the reader, are discovering this new land. And that act of discovery is very exciting. And you're filling it in. And so it's a very active process. Once you've got it all filled in, you go into book 2 and 3. The challenge to the writer is to come up with something new for you to discover because you've already got the world in your mind, and so that much of the what makes the writing of book one so appealing is lost. Because it's already been done. Um, so detail on the list of elements, I always list detail last, not because it's least important, but because I look at detail as an editing process. Create the story, figure out what you're going to say, what you want your audience to get, and then at the end say, all right, which are the moments in this story that are most important for them to really vividly see? And that's when you go back and say, well, that's where I need to put in the detail. You only get so much detail in the story. You're always trying to, as you say, get the most bang for your buck. So you're trying to be very judicious in putting in the detail, and yet you have to be generous enough in the detail so that they can always visualize the story.
Hmm.
And it becomes an editing process, something to think about after you've created the story, not while you're create the story first, and then figure out how use detail to drive the images of it into the audience's mind.
The last technical point I wanted to ask you before I just ask you a couple of broader questions is about the residual resolution emotion.
Ah,
So,
yeah.
which is again, a lot of these things. My impression I got, perhaps because I've read so many books on storytelling, and a lot of these people have been influenced by you. But the impression I got is, I know this. I just never called it this way, and I've never seen it described in this much detail. But to anyone who doesn't automatically get what that means, what is residual resolution emotion?
Um, the question is, well, what it is the feeling that the audience is left with immediately after the story is finished.
Okay.
Why do you care? If you're just trying to entertain, um, you don't care as much. I mean, you do care. You don't want people to walk out, finish the story, and walk out so depressed that they want to go shoot themselves in the head. But um, if you're trying to persuade, to influence, to affect the audience in any way, that residual resolution emotion becomes critical. It is the driving force that will make someone actually act. Um, the way that they feel at the very as the story ends determines how impactful that story will be and how likely it is to affect their beliefs, attitudes, values, their future behavior. The elements that create it are surprise. Is the how surprising is the ending? Is how different is this ending from the ending I expected? Satisfaction. How different is this ending from the ending I want or think is most just? The greater those two differences are, the greater, the more powerful that emotion is, and the more that story becomes a driver of behavior change.
So
So
one thing I want to make sure that we get to that, and take your time circling around if you
yeah,
if you need to. But the difference between the types of change and the types of influence that can be achieved by a positive residual resolution emotion and a negative one, because again, it's one of those things that the negative one I could kind of take a stab at if you had asked me before I read the book. But the what the positive one does, that to me was very surprising and insightful. So if at the end of a story, if it's a story that ends, it doesn't end badly necessarily, but you feel negative emotion towards it, injustice, unfairness,
yeah,
then those can be used, or can trigger what types of action in your
they tend
experience?
to drive negative endings, negative emotional endings.
Yes.
The story's over and I'm angry, I'm outraged. I say, no, that's not right. Yet they tend to drive immediate behavioral action. You want to do something. You want to have people write letters to a congressman. You want to have them get out on the street and join a march. You want to start a riot. Have a story end negatively. And in fact, we did for the U.S. Department of Defense. I did some research looking at stories that have been particularly effective by Al Qaeda, by ISIS, by the Taliban, and those that have been particularly effective at recruiting or at fundraising are all ones that have ended negatively for their target audience, which were young Arab males in the 18 to 35-year-old age range. Have a story end negatively. That way, it makes people want to do something to fix the story. But it doesn't tend to change long-term attitudes, beliefs, values. You do something, you take an action, and then having taken the action, you feel satisfied and go back to the thinking and feeling exactly the way you did before. Um, and in fact, the gold standard for influence stories in research labs in the US, particularly in colleges and universities that do these sort of experiments all the time, have been stories that end negatively so that people would be more willing to immediately donate money to a cause. Stories that end well tend not to get very much donation. And so that the thought has been, well, if you really want action, you have to have a story end negatively. That's true short term, but long term, negative endings tend not to have long term effects on behavior, on attitude, on belief, on values, but positive ending stories. And if you look at most religions and the stories that they share, most of them do end positively. And what those tend to do is not cause immediate behavioral shift, but do tend to be long-term role model stories. So they tend to get held in memory, and over time, as situations arise, where that story applies to a situation where a person now finds themselves, those stories tend to pop up and affect long-term behavior. So long-term behavioral shifts represent featured or caused by long-term shifts in attitudes, beliefs, values tend to be more driven by positive ending stories, which means that neither of those is illegitimate. They're both very powerful and effective tools. The question is, what do you want your target audience to do? Do you want to cause a long-term behavioral shift? Do you want to have an immediate action response? So that you design the story that you want and the ending that you want and the emotion that you want people to feel at the end of that story to achieve the effect that you originally designed and said that you want to create. Again, it's all about using the tools to achieve what you want to achieve.
And on the final question on the elements is, were you able to tell from your experiments if, in order to benefit from the power of story and from getting your message across the right way, do you need to use a story or the elements by themselves, as long as they can be understood as what they are by the audience, would achieve the same result?
And the answer is, in the mind of the receiver, it's going to be formed into story. So if you put it in story form, it makes it easier for them to put your story in your terms in their minds. But what's critical are the elements. So if you're doing a talk, if you're doing a lecture, if you're doing a podcast, if you're doing a blog, you don't have to say, here's a story and do a story, but be aware of the elements. Be aware of how you're inserting them into this thing you're creating, and try to be very aware. Try to put yourself in the mind of your target audience and say, how are they going to infer information out of this that's going to create a story in their minds? What story is going to happen in their minds? So think in terms of the story elements, knowing that ultimately, in the only place you care about, and that's what happens in the conscious mind and memory of your target audience, that's going to be a story. You don't have to put it in story forms, but you have to be aware of what are the elements that your target audience is going to use to create the stories that they create. And they don't necessarily do it automatically. They may not think, oh, I'm going to turn this into a story. It happens at a subconscious level, but it always happens.
One thing that I wonder now when I talk to people about storytelling is that, maybe I'm being optimistic, but hasn't the battle to convince people that stories are not something we think work, but something that actually work, and that we have the science for it, hasn't that battle to a great extent been won? And what I'm trying to ask here is, have we not? Isn't it in the mainstream already that its stories are scientifically backed to work? So now we can actually stop talking about the science.
And I would say story is the sort of the nom de jour. It is the buzzword for the deck, maybe for a couple of years. The risk is, when you do that people will say, good, I'll tell a story and that'll take care of everything. And they tell a story, an ineffective story, a story that was poorly crafted and poorly designed, and then say, stories didn't work. And like so many other fads, story in the mind of many people will fade. My concern is that the science of story isn't getting out nearly as broadly. Both the science itself and the idea that there is a real science behind it isn't getting out nearly as quickly and nearly as broadly as it needs to keep pace with the fad version of story and storytelling. Everyone says, just tell your stories and that'll work. Well, really, what you should be saying is just tell effective stories designed specifically to achieve the effect you want to create, and that'll take care of it, and that's right. But there's a big difference between just tell your story and just tell an effective story that'll achieve the effect that you want to create. Those two are unfortunately very different, and there are far too many people that aren't relating to the elements that control the process of going from just tell your story to tell an effective story.
All right. So, sorry, go on, finish.
Nope, we'll call that the end. I was just going to reiterate it, but go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna end or move us toward the end by going back to your beginning, in that we as we discussed, you had been teaching this for a long time. My understanding from your story is that you originally learned story in a fairly instinctive way. This wasn't your science. This is not something
No.
you researched to learn to do. And instinctively you arrived at the elements that the science later validated. So you got to them without having to raise a hypothesis and then do the scientific process. So what I'm wondering now, that goes on to a broader question about how to teach story, is when you do a workshop now or give training, does it look terribly different than it used to do before all the science proved that you were right?
Yes, and the difference is, uh, and let me use a little analogy. One of my favorite storytellers is a guy named Jay O'Callahan. Uh, he was one of the people who got into storytelling about 5 or 6 years before I did. And so when I was a brand new storyteller, he was, of all the American storytellers, certainly, was the one who told stories the way I wanted to tell stories. So I went, I hung out with him when I could, and I took a couple of workshops from him. And he is really a master storyteller. And one of his lines was always, "There's a rhythm to the story. You just listen to the rhythm, and it tells you how to pace the story." And people would say, "Well, but how do you do that?" And he'd say, "You just listen to the rhythm of the story." And they'd say, but I don't. How do I do that? He said, "You just listen to the rhythm." So when I first started doing workshops, I in a similar way, I would say, Here's the story. And it works. Trust me, it works. Now what I can do is lead them to those elements. Not say, and going back to the brick wall analogy, now I can really show them, rather than say, "Okay, here's what the wall looks like. Go build your own." I can say, "Okay, here are all the tools. Here are all the elements you have, and let's look at each of those elements and talk very specifically, with a certainty that I know what I'm talking about when I talk about each of those little elements." And then once we've talked about the individual elements, say, "Now let's start seeing what it looks like when you build them together. What are your options? What does it look like when you pair them together? How do they interact with each other? How do they interact with the brain of the audience?" So it's now I'm in a position to be able to not only say, "Well, this works," but show them first exactly why and how it works, and second, with whatever knowledge base and whatever attitudes, whatever skills, natural tendencies they have coming into the project, into that workshop, I can show them how to go from where they are to becoming real masters of each of those elements, so that they are fully in control of both crafting and then delivering the stories that they want to deliver to achieve the effects that they want to achieve.
Yeah, the challenge and the concern for me is always how much information is enough and how much is too much, because most of the people that I work with, they're telling real stories. They're using them usually more like a business context than a performative one.
Sure.
So there is this thing, like Jay, to some extent I'm a natural, and then I have to
Mhm.
deconstruct what I'm doing. And I was like, oh, what did that worked because I did, but I'm not. Even though I have specific structures that I teach and I have elements that I teach as important ones, I don't. That's not how the story comes to be in my mind. I might say to people, a story needs a relatable character who has a problem that they care about, and it needs to be told with specific detail and a moment in time. But I'm not thinking that way when I put a story together. The story exists, something happened, and then I start saying, okay, with this and that, and then I use them as diagnostics tools.
Right.
But I don't always find that for people, if you say this is a structure you can use, these are the elements that ideally need to be there, a lot of people just look at that and freeze. So to me, it's always finding that balance between tell me what happened, and then now let's craft it, to let's craft it in a way that actually makes a good story before you have developed it to a certain extent.
Right. And so that there is always that dynamic tension between, uh, oh, I need to tell a story next week, and so I just want to work on this story, to I want to understand how all the stories work. Um, this is learning that happens experientially. And what I find I'm better at now than I used to be is guiding people to experience those different elements and the effect of those elements. That is to say, what they can do when they suddenly think about, within the context of their own stories, think about one element or another element. Uh, Rather than being something that's learned academically, story and storytelling are learned experientially. And so, as my job is to guide them to experience both effective, ineffective stories, and the effect of each of these various different elements on story, on how that helps them do what they wanted to do. Often, people see a story in their head, and the story they see in their head is a great story. And the question is, well, how do you get it out of your head into someone else's head and make it that same kind of a great story, effective story? And one of the greatest things for a human being to learn as a storyteller is to stop thinking like you and get out of your head and be the audience and look at your story, your material, purely from the viewpoint of your audience, which means you have to understand who that audience is. Who's my target audience? Who do I want to get this to? How are they going to look at this story? And look at the story from their point of view, with their concerns and their issues and their interest level, and knowing then what's going to engage them, what's going to hook them, what's going to be relevant to them. How do I get them to see this story? And that's something that has to be learned a little bit, to get out of your own head, because as you say, you start a story and you think, well, I can see the story in my head, and so that's the way we'll put it together. Well, people who are just natural storytellers, naturally effective storytellers, and I was lucky enough to naturally fall into that when I started telling, do pretty well on their own. But most people are not. Most people aren't natural at being able to effectively take a story out of their own minds, translate it into language, facial expression, gestures, and give it to another person, so that when that other person puts it back together in their minds, they see the same story that the teller had in their minds. And those are the people who can benefit a lot from understanding in a more conscious way, what are the tools I have? What are the elements that I have to work with? And how does it feel when I try to use those? And that's what workshops and storytelling classes really can do.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ongoing challenges that will remain an ongoing challenge,
Oh, sure.
because I think that if everybody had a tenth of the passion and the time that anyone gets into storytelling dedicates to it, everything would be easier. But we are talking about busy people who don't necessarily, who sometimes see this as a tool or a means to an end, and expecting them to dedicate themselves so much to it, other than the occasional workshop or the book that they read, is sometimes too much. So I don't believe you actually
Sure.
arrive at any perfect formula
No.
for teaching this stuff. But I think what I'm hoping is that eventually I find the perfect formula for me, for for the specific audience that I'm
Well,
trying to serve.
but of course, the trouble is every audience is a little different.
Sure.
And so what's perfect for that audience is different than what's perfect for another audience. And as a teacher, still, every time I face a new group or a new individual, if I'm doing one-on work, it's not a question of what's perfect for me to teach. It's where are they, and what's the best thing for them to do right now to be nudged in a constructive direction. So you're always just doing little nudges from where people are in the direction that that they need to go. Hmm. And you're
Sure.
right. It's always a challenge.
Yeah.
That's what makes teachers really artists. It is an art form to be able to
And
figure out where is this other human being, and how do I get them in an experiential way to get to wherever I know that they need to go.
it's a challenge, but it's also part of the fun of it. I think if you completely cracked it, it will feel robotic after a while, doing the exact same thing, group after group, person after person, year after year. So the fact that it changes and evolves, and you change and evolve sometimes within the same group, that's a fantastic part of it.
Yeah.
Kendall, you are the repository of all scientific storytelling knowledge. I think I could keep you around for a lot longer, but I want to be mindful of your time. And yet, one more time, thank you again for waking up so early to do this. When I do this podcast with people that are in the US, and I'm in Europe, and I know it's sometimes gruesome for them to have to wake up early, but I think you were up at 6 in the morning for this, right?
Well, actually, I'm a morning person, so I'm usually up by 4:30 or so.
Oh,
Uh,
you were one of those people. Well,
one of
I have a toddler, so unfortunately, I've been
Yep.
made into a morning person. Okay, well, Kendall, if anyone wants to find out more about your work, so obviously they can go up to any place where books are sold and look for Story Proof or Story Smart. Those, I think, the main ones for the
For
scientific
the
side of it. Where else should they look for your work?
website and that's just kendallhaven.com. And other than that, I am mostly out working with corporations and government agencies, and out on tour doing the consulting work.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's my pleasure also, and thank you for having me on.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And until next time.